I'm going to be reading Chapter 7 of the Geography of You and Me. For the next 2 days, Lucy got herself out of bed and went to school. She sat through her classes and tolerated her classmates. She looked for Owen each morning and then again each afternoon. And when she didn't see him, she returned to her apartment, trying not to be disappointed, and ate dinner alone. Then on the third day, George appeared at the door to help carry her suitcase downstairs and hail her a cab to the airport. Just before midnight on the day the lights came back, her parents had finally gotten through to her. Lucy had been asleep already, and when she reached for her phone and saw a jumble of numbers too long to be local, she picked it up. It was morning in Paris, and her parents were on 2 separate extensions, wide awake and talking over each other. "Lucy," her dad kept saying. "Luce, are you okay?" "I'm fine," she said groggily, sitting up in bed, "just sleepy." "We've been trying and trying," Mom said, her usually clipped accent softened by worry. "You gave us such a fright." "I couldn't get through," Lucy explained, fully awake now. "The circuits were all busy, but it's fine. I'm okay." "Listen," Dad said, his voice brisk and businesslike. "We want to hear all about it, but first you should know that I called the airline." Lucy waited for them to say they were coming home early, that they'd fought tooth and nail to get a flight back. She had heard on the news earlier that the airports were all overrun with stranded travelers who had been stuck there since the power went out, living on pretzels and sleeping at the gates, and that it would take days for the schedules to return to normal. But her father must have figured something out, must surely know the type of people who could help, or at least the type of people who knew other people. And Lucy felt a sudden rush of gratitude for her parents, who must have been trying to get home to her this whole time. And I've got you on a flight to London on Friday," Dad was saying, and Lucy's mouth fell open as she pressed the phone closer to her ear. "I know you've got school that day, but how much do they actually cover in the first week anyways, right?" "London?" she said, her voice cracking. "Yes, London," Dad said impatiently. "Yes, London," Dad said impatiently, as if this were a ridiculous question. "Your mother and I are going tomorrow, and you'll meet us there on Friday." Lucy was torn between the impulse to simply agree, in case they might change their minds, and the urge to ask 1,000 more questions. Why?" "We want to see you, darling," her mother said. "We want to make sure you're all right." "I'm fine," she said. Coming home was out of the question," Dad said, once again businesslike. "So we'd like you to meet us there." Lucy felt like laughing. On the scale of worldwide emergencies, nothing could have given her a truer sense for where the blackout ranked. Not urgent enough for her parents to interrupt a trip, but just alarming enough for them to buy her a plane ticket. The details were discussed and the rest of the plans were arranged. Lucy would miss the 2 days of school, but she'd be getting a cultural experience, which seemed like justification enough. She thought of her earlier trips over, once she was 5, once she was 8. The first time had been during Christmas. They'd visited her grandmother in the stately townhouse where her mother had grown up, and all toured the city together, the ornate Parliament buildings, and the giant clock that towered over them, Oxford Street with its garlands and wreaths, and St. Paul's Cathedral, where Lucy had sung carols, her voice loud and warbling beside her mother's more melodic one. They went again 3 years later, just after her grandmother had passed away, a more somber trip that was spent mostly in the living room of the old townhouse, nodding politely to black-clad strangers and playing cards on the floor with her brothers. Still, she had loved it there. It was the thing that, even more than the postcards, had sparked her obsession with travel. When she was little, she believed the whole world, or at least all its cities, would look exactly like New York. Tall and jagged and imposing. She had no other basis for comparison, and it seemed only logical that a city was a city, just as a farm was a farm, and a mountain was a mountain. But London was completely different from what she'd imagined. It was regal and charming, stately and enchanting, and she'd fallen under its spell from the moment she arrived. So she was excited to be going back now. It wasn't Paris and it wasn't Cape Town. It wasn't Sydney or Rio, and it wasn't anywhere new. But it was definitely somewhere. And there was nobody she wanted to tell more than Owen. But she still hadn't been able to bring herself to knock on the door of the basement apartment. And as often as she'd lingered in the lobby, making small talk with the doorman, she still hadn't run into him again. Even now, as she waited on the curb while George tried to flag down a cab, she couldn't help glancing back towards the lobby one last time, hoping he might appear. But there was no sign of him, and there hadn't been in 3 days. It was almost as if she'd made him up entirely. At the airport, she sat at the gate and watched out the window as the planes took off, trying to decide whether it was nerves or excitement that was making her stomach churn. This was what she'd wanted, of course, but it wasn't how she'd pictured it happening. Being sent rather than invited, summoned rather than whisked away. On the plane, she sank low in her seat, looking out the window while the other passengers boarded. Her thoughts drifted to Owen again, the way his eyes had flashed when he spoke about traveling the country, and she was so focused on this, so lost in the memory of him, that when someone sat down heavily beside her and she turned to find that it wasn't him, that it was instead an old Englishman with red cheeks and whiskers in his nose, she was more surprised than it made sense to be. She slept the whole way across the Atlantic, the night passing as the ocean slipped by beneath the plane, and when she woke, it was to discover that they'd caught up with the morning, the light streaming through the oval windows, all up and down the length of the plane. She rubbed her eyes and squinted out at the clouds that tumbled over the city and the fine mist of rain that clung to the plane as they landed. There was a car waiting for her just outside the arrivals area, and she sat in the back seat and tried to keep her blurry eyes open as it glided through the rainy London streets. She realized how much she'd forgotten in the last 8 years. It was half a lifetime ago that she was here, and only now did she recall the quirky details of the place. The colorful doors and the painted signs on the pubs, the roundabouts and the lamp posts, the buildings that stood shoulder to shoulder along the winding streets. The townhouse had long ago been sold, so her parents now stayed at the Ritz whenever they were in the city. Lucy couldn't help staring as they pulled up to the grand old building, wreathed in lights, and a bellhop appeared out of nowhere to help her with her suitcase. When she told the man at the front desk that she was looking for her parents, he gave her the room number and then pointed to the doorway behind her. "The lift is just around the corner," he said, and Lucy smiled all the way up to the 6th floor, wondering if there would be much difference to getting stuck in a lift instead of an elevator. Upstairs, she knocked on the door to her parents' room. When it opened, they were both standing there as if they'd been waiting. Her mother, tall and willowy, her hair dark as Lucy's, and her father, sandy-haired and enormous, with glasses and a haircut that made him look every inch as serious as he was. They were both generally reserved, not prone to huge amounts of affection, but before the door had even closed, Lucy found herself folded into a hug, tucked between the two of them in a way that felt so safe, so overwhelming, and most of all so surprising that she began to cry without meaning to. "We're so sorry," Mom said, letting go and looking to her with concern. "If we'd known—" "No, it's fine," Lucy said, wiping her eyes. "It really wasn't a big deal. I don't know why I'm crying. I guess I'm just happy to see you." "We're happy to see you too," Dad said, bringing her suitcase in from the hallway and then closing the door. Because of some scheduling things, we couldn't get back. But we felt terrible that you were all alone through an ordeal like that, and we just really wanted to see you." Lucy felt a little dazed by all the attention. "I'm fine," she said for what felt like the 1,000th time, as Mom guided her over to the bed where they sat together on the edge, knees touching. "So what was it like?" Dad asked as he pulled out the desk chair. Once seated, he crossed his legs and gave her a long look, the kind she'd seen him give lawyers and bankers when they'd come for dinner. It was a look that meant she had his full concentration, and it wasn't one she was used to seeing. "It was dark," she said, and Mom laughed. "I was actually in the elevator when it happened. We heard," Dad said. "The boys told us." Lucy had called her brothers the very next day, first Charlie and then Ben, and she told them about the climbing out of the elevator and walking up and down the stairwells. She told them about the doormen running around with flashlights and the masses of people moving through the streets. She told them about the free ice cream and the stars overhead and the heat, but she hadn't told them about Owen. Part of it was self-preservation. She knew Ben would tease her endlessly, and Charlie would get overprotective. But part of it was instinct too. It would have been like blowing out the candles on a birthday cake and then immediately announcing what you'd wish for. Logical or not, saying it out loud made it seem less likely to come true. Was it awful? Mom was asking, her eyes wide with worry. It wasn't so bad, Lucy said with a smile, hoping they didn't notice the pink that crept into her cheeks. We were only in there for like half an hour, she paused, realizing for the first time that it was true. It couldn't have been more than 30 minutes. How had it felt like so much more? The worst part of it was the heat, she continued. That was pretty horrible. They both nodded, like they wanted to hear more, but she thought she noticed Dad sneak a glance at his watch, and Mom's foot had started to bob in a way it did sometimes when guests at their dinner parties were still there, even after the coffee cups had been cleared. You should have seen it though, Lucy pressed on. The whole skyline just blinked out, and all the streets were completely full of people. It was unbelievable. This time, Dad didn't bother to disguise it when he looked at his watch and Mom cleared her throat. Listen, darling, she said. We want to hear a lot more about all this at dinner tonight, but we figured you'd want to nap, so we thought we'd head out for a little while. Oh, Lucy said. Where? Dad looked up, his face a picture of confusion. What do you mean? I mean, Lucy said, raising her eyebrows. Where are you planning to go? We made some plans before we knew you'd be here, too, Mom said, giving Dad a sideways glance. I'm getting my hair done, and your father has a meeting. Lucy turned back to him, but he seemed suddenly interested in his shoes. Well, where is it? Maybe I'll tag along. Go explore a new neighborhood. He coughed, his face reddening. We just assumed you'd be tired. I slept on the plane, she said, and they exchanged a look. Okay, seriously, she said, glancing from one to the other. What's going on? Nothing, Dad started to say, but Mom rolled her eyes. Let's just tell her now. Tell me what? Lucy asked, suddenly anxious. Dad was playing with his wedding ring, a nervous habit. Did I say wedding ring? Oh, wait. Sorry. Dad was playing with his wedding ring, a nervous habit of his. We were going to wait for dinner. Listen, Mom said, taking one of Lucy's hand in hers. You know how much I miss it over here. Lucy nodded, frowning. And you know that we'd always planned to live abroad again once the three of you were off to university, right? This was true. Ever since she was little, Mom had spoken dreamily of returning to London. She'd never really been at home in New York, where she found the summers too hot and the people too rude, the garbage too visible and the culture too limited. It had only been a matter of time before they moved back to London, where they'd first met all those years ago, and Lucy and her brothers had always known this, but they promised it wouldn't be until all three kids had left for college. Now, however, Mom was giving Lucy a pleading look, whether for understanding or forgiveness, she didn't know. Well, she was saying, her voice a bit too bright, an opportunity has come up a little early. They called me about an open position in the UK office, Dad jumped in, his eyes shining behind his glasses. I'd heard rumors about it, but it's very high level, so I didn't think I'd have a shot. But it looks like he might, Mom finished, looking at him proudly, and it won't be long now until we find out for sure. Right, Dad said. Just a few more meetings today, and then we'll see. Lucy stared at him. So we'd be moving to London? Yes, Dad said, beaming. Next year? Mom shook her head. Next month. Next month? Lucy asked, reeling a bit. She could feel that her voice had risen an octave, and her eyes had gone wide, but she couldn't help it. Next month, she thought, astonished by the nearness of it. It wouldn't be, Dad began, but Lucy cut him off. What about the apartment? Well, we'd keep it, of course, he said, in case we wanted to go back there for the summer, or if the boys ended up with internships there. Lucy stared at him. What about school? I've looked into it, Mom said with a hint of a smile, and it seems they have those over here as well. and since you've never exactly loved your old school." She was right, of course, but Lucy wasn't sure about what to say. After 16 whole years in New York, it almost didn't matter what she loved and what she didn't. The city was a part of her, and she a part of it. The idea that she could be living in London in just a few short weeks struck her as wildly unimaginable. She opened her mouth and then closed it again, blinking at them. "I know this is a lot of information all at once," Mom said gently, her brow furrowed as she looked over at Dad. He leaned forward, steepling his hands together. "And it's not for sure yet," he said, "though I'm hoping we'll have something to celebrate soon." "London," Lucy repeated, and Mom smiled encouragingly. "You love it here. I love New York too." Dad waved this away. "We've done New York," he said. "It's time for a change, don't you think?" "I don't know," Lucy said, fumbling for the words. Why don't we pick this up over dinner later?" Dad suggested, clapping his hands on his knees and then standing up. "You can take a nap while Mom gets her hair done, and then you two can meet up and do some shopping or something." "I'm not," Lucy was about to say tired, but there didn't seem to be a point. Dad stood there smoothing his tie while Mom rose to grab her purse. "That sounds fine." They left in a flurry of noise, reminders that if she needed anything, Lucy could call the front desk and that she should feel free to order room service if she was hungry. They gave her some cash and promised they'd see her soon. They told her not to think too much about what they discussed until they all knew more, and then when they were gone, Lucy was all alone again. London, she thought, the words sinking inside her. She waited only a few minutes before grabbing her bag and heading out the door, too restless to stay put. As she walked, her mind spun furiously, and she found herself gawking at everything she passed. The white columns buildings, the striped crosswalks, the pharmacies and fruit shops, the cafes and pubs. The whole world suddenly seen through a whole new lens. Everything was so different here, which had only a few hours before been precisely the point. But now it felt foreign and strange, the unusual street names and the squat buildings. The shops were unfamiliar and the traffic was heading in the wrong direction. And it was only the first week of September, but everyone was already wearing winter coats. Lucy wasn't sure where she was exactly, but she kept moving anyway, too anxious to do anything but walk. A low fog hung over the streets, making everything damp and silvery, and she tugged the sleeves of her hoodie over her hands and pushed on. It wasn't until she found herself approaching Piccadilly Circus, the huge electric signs burning through the mist, that she paused. It was the very first thing that reminded her of New York, and she stood there in the middle of the sidewalk thinking of Times Square, the panic loosening its grip on her. She took a deep breath as she scanned the plaza. There were huddles of tourists peering in windows, brightly colored billboards, a few pigeons poking around near a fountain, and, of course, the enormous stone buildings that formed a kind of cavern all around her. It was beautiful in a way, in its own way. She thought it again. London. Only this time there was something lighter about it, a word like a sigh, like a possibility. Just as she was about to turn back for the hotel, she spotted a small souvenir shop up ahead, the windows filled with little red buses and teacups with pictures of the Queen. She walked over to take a closer look, drawn by the display of the postcards just outside the door, and she spun the rack so the images whizzed by in a blur of color. Buckingham Palace and Westminster Abbey, Big Ben, and a series of red phone booths. Finally she came to an aerial shot. The city spread out from a distance, the river Thames woven through it like a gray ribbon, and there written on top of it, all in bold blue letters, were the words, "Wish you were here." Inside the shop, she slid a 5-pound note across the counter. "I'll take this," she said, waving the postcards, "and a stamp as well." The clerk, a young woman with purple hair and a nose ring, rolled her eyes when she saw it. "Wish you were here," she said, snapping her gum. "Right." Lucy only smiled. "Can I borrow a pen too?" After writing her note, she walked back out into the street. The fog was starting to lift now, the sun coming through unevenly. Lucy clutched the postcard in one hand, running a thumb along its edges as she looked around for a mailbox. She was halfway back to the hotel when she finally spotted one, and she realized why it had taken her so long. She'd been searching for the familiar blue, but here the mailboxes, like the buses and phone booths, were a brilliant shade of red. For a moment she stood holding the little piece of cardboard over the open mouth of the chute. She was thinking about the mailroom back home in her apartment building, the wall of brass squares etched with numbers, and just beside them, the door leading down to the basement. But what she was really imagining was Owen. His blonde head bent over the postcard, smiling as he read the words, and in spite of herself, she realized she was smiling too. Just as the sun broke, oh my gosh, this is the last sentence, I'm so sorry. Just as the sun broke through the clouds, she let go. That's the end of chapter 7. I'm sorry I kept stuttering. Thanks for watching.